In May 2015, India did not have a heat wave. It had something that did not yet have a name adequate to what it was: a convergence of temperature, geography, poverty, and institutional failure that killed 2,500 people in 10 days and left researchers looking for language that could accurately describe a catastrophe that had happened in plain sight in one of the most densely populated regions on Earth, watched by hundreds of millions of people who were themselves trying to survive it. The number 2,500 is the official figure. It is a number that appeared in government reports and international news coverage and the academic papers that followed. Researchers who studied the event using excess mortality methodology, the same approach that revealed 70,000 dead in Europe in 2003, estimated the actual death toll at between 4,500 and 6,000. The gap between the official count and the estimated count exists for the same reason such gaps always exist. Heat death is quiet, and quiet deaths in India in 2015, particularly among the rural poor, were not always reaching the hospitals and official records that would have captured them. The ones that did reach the records were enough. To understand what happened in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana in May 2015, you need to understand what those states are and what May is. Andhra Pradesh and Telangana together cover a territory roughly the size of France in the southeastern part of the Indian subcontinent. Their combined population in 2015 was approximately 84 million people. The landscape is a mix of coastal lowlands, river deltas, and the Deccan Plateau, a vast elevated plain of black cotton soil that absorbs heat during the day and radiates it through the night. The cities Hyderabad, Vijayawada, Guntur, Nellore are dense, loud, layered, millions of people compressed into urban forms that were not designed to temperatures they now routinely experience. May in this region is the hottest month of the year. This is not unusual. May has always been the hottest month. The pre-monsoon period, the weeks before the rains arrive and break the heat, has always been brutal. Temperatures in the mid-40s are not extraordinary. Farmers know this. Laborers know this. The people who work outside in May in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana have been working outside in May for generations, and they know what the heat is, and they manage it through a combination of experience and adaptation, and the particular endurance that people develop when the alternative to enduring is not eating. May 2015 was not the heat they knew. The temperatures that arrived in the third week of May 2015 were not the mid-40s that the region expected. They were 47, 48 degrees Celsius in the shade, and shade, for most of the people who died, was not available. The heat index, the combination of temperature and humidity that measures what the body actually experiences, pushed the felt temperature above 55 degrees in some locations. The overnight lows did not drop below 32 degrees for 11 consecutive nights. The body had no recovery window. The monsoon, which normally arrives in early June and which the entire subcontinent orients its agricultural and social calendar around, was late. It was not late by much. 10 days, perhaps 2 weeks. In an ordinary year, this would be an inconvenience. In May 2015, with temperatures at 48 degrees and no overnight relief, 10 extra days without the monsoon was a variable that pushed the death toll from a bad heat event into a catastrophe. The first person in this story is a man named Raju. He was 53 years old and worked as a construction laborer in the city of Vijayawada, which sits on the Krishna River in the heart of Andhra Pradesh, and which in May 2015 recorded temperatures of 47.5 degrees Celsius, the highest in the city's recorded history. Raju was from a village 40 kilometers away. He had been coming to Vijayawada for work for 20 years, staying in a labor camp during the week and returning home on Sundays. His work was outdoor construction, carrying materials, mixing concrete, the physical labor that built the city around him while he lived in a corrugated metal shed at its edge. The shed had no insulation. At night, it was hotter than outside. On the morning of May 22nd, Raju woke at 4 a.m., which was his normal time, and ate rice and drank 2 cups of chai and walked to the construction site, which was 40 minutes on foot. By the time he arrived, the temperature was already 38 degrees. By 9 a.m., it was 43. By 11 a.m., it was 47. The site had no shade structure. The contractor had not provided one because shade structures cost money, and the contract price had not included them, and nobody had required him to include them. There was a water point, a tap connected to a municipal line that ran intermittently, which in May 2015 meant it ran in the early morning and sometimes in the evening, and not reliably in between. Raju drank from the tap at 7 a.m. when it was running. He did not drink again until 2 p.m. because the tap was not running, and he had not brought enough water of his own, and buying water from the vendors who came to the site cost money. He was calculating carefully. Between 7 a.m. and 2 p.m., he worked in 47-degree heat and drank nothing. He did not fall on the site. He made it to the end of the shift, which ended at 3 p.m., because even the contractor understood that working past 3 in those temperatures was not survivable, and he began the 40-minute walk back to the labor camp. He collapsed on the road at approximately 3:40 p.m. The road on which Raju collapsed was not empty. Roads in Vijayawada in the afternoon are never empty. Auto rickshaws, motorcycles, trucks, pedestrians, the constant dense movement of a city that does not stop. Several people saw him go down. A man on a motorcycle stopped. A woman selling vegetables from a cart came over. An auto rickshaw driver pulled to the side. What they found was a man unconscious on the asphalt. The asphalt surface temperature at 3:40 p.m. on May 22nd in Vijayawada was approximately 65 degrees Celsius. He had been on it for less than 2 minutes, and the exposed skin of his arms was already showing contact burns. The motorcycle driver and the auto rickshaw driver lifted him and put him in the auto rickshaw. The nearest government hospital was 3 kilometers away. They drove. The hospital's emergency department had received 41 heat stroke patients that day before Raju arrived. It had been designed for a daily emergency capacity of approximately 60 patients total. All conditions, all emergencies. The doctor who treated him was 28 years old, 2 years out of medical school, and had seen more heat stroke in the previous 7 days than in the entirety of her training. She knew what to do. She did efficiently and without the resources she needed, and with the particular focus of someone who has stopped counting how many patients are waiting and started just treating the one in front of them. She got his temperature down. It took 40 minutes and the last of the ward's ice supply and 2 bags of 4-saline that had been allocated for other patients. Raju survived. The man who had been brought in 2 hours before him did not. The second person in this story never made it to a hospital. Her name was Lakshmi. She was 67 years old and lived in a village in Guntur district, 70 kilometers from Vijayawada. She had been a rice farmer her entire life. Not a large farm, a small plot worked by her family for 3 generations, enough to eat and a little more in a good year. In May 2015, the fields were dry. The irrigation water had not come on schedule because the canal system upstream was being managed for a drought that had been building since the previous monsoon. Lakshmi went to fields anyway on the morning of May 24th because the fields were hers and the crop was there, and the work that needed doing did not stop because the temperature was 46 degrees. Her daughter-in-law, who was at the house with the children, expected her back by noon. At noon, she did not come. At 1 p.m., she did not come. At 2 p.m., the daughter-in-law left the children with a neighbor and walked to the fields. She found Lakshmi under the single tree at the edge of the field, a neem tree that Lakshmi had been walking toward when she sat down and could not get up again. She was conscious, barely. Her skin was dry and hot. Her eyes were open but focused on something the daughter-in-law could not see. The nearest clinic was 8 kilometers away. There was no vehicle available. The daughter-in-law ran back to the village and found a man with a motorcycle, and they returned and got Lakshmi onto the motorcycle between them. 3 people on a motorcycle on a dirt road in 46-degree heat, and drove to the clinic. The clinic had 1 doctor and no ice and no 4 fluids and no air conditioning. The doctor did what he could with what he had, which was water and a fan and a wet cloth, and the knowledge that what he was looking at required more than he had. He called the district hospital for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. Lakshmi died on the way to the hospital. Her core temperature at the clinic, taken with a standard oral thermometer because that was what the clinic had, was 40.8 degrees, and that reading, the doctor noted, was almost certainly lower than the actual core temperature because oral thermometers underread in heat stroke patients whose mouths are dry. She had been a rice farmer for 50 years in a region where the heat had always been brutal and manageable and had this year become something else. By May 25th, the hospitals of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana were beyond capacity. Not approaching capacity. Beyond it. The government hospital in Guntur had 340 heatstroke admissions in 5 days. Its normal monthly emergency intake for all conditions combined was approximately 800. The hospital in Nellore had run out of 4 fluids by the 24th and had sent staff to private pharmacies with cash to buy what they could find on the open market. The hospital in Onlo had set up cots in the corridor, then in the parking area under a temporary awning. Because the ward were full and the patients kept coming. The pattern across every facility was the same. The patients arriving in the morning were the ones who had collapsed the previous afternoon and evening and had spent the night being transported by auto rickshaw, by motorcycle, by bullock cart in the rural areas, from wherever they had fallen to wherever there was a doctor. The delay between collapse and treatment was measured not in minutes, but in hours, and in some rural cases in days. And by the time many of them arrived, the window for the interventions that would have made the difference had already closed. The Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh held a press conference on May 25th. He described the situation as serious and announced emergency measures, free water distribution at public points, restrictions on outdoor work between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m., public awareness campaigns through radio and television, deployment of additional medical personnel to affected districts. The measures were real. They were also 5 days late and implemented in a state where the infrastructure to enforce or deliver them was stretched to its limits by the same heat that had created the emergency. The outdoor work restriction, for example, was announced on May 25th. On May 26th, construction laborers across Vijayawada and Hyderabad were on their sites at 7 a.m. because the restriction carried no enforcement mechanism, and the contractors had not been told to stop, and the workers had not been told they had the legal right to refuse, and because for a laborer paid by the day, the decision not to work is a decision not to eat. Raju was back on the site on May 26th. He had been discharged from the hospital the previous evening. The doctor who had treated him had told him to rest for 3 days and drink at least 4 liters of water daily and stay out of direct sun. She had said this in Telugu, clearly looking directly at him. He had nodded. He had understood. He went back to work the next morning because 3 days without wages was a calculation. He could not make work. The asphalt deserves its own explanation because it was killing people separately from the air temperature, and the mechanism is specific enough to matter. Asphalt roads in Indian cities may absorb solar radiation throughout the day and reach surface temperatures significantly higher than the air. In Vijayawada on May 22nd, the air temperature was 47.5 degrees Celsius. The asphalt surface temperature on the main roads, measured by a researcher from the National Institute of Disaster Management, who was in the city documenting the event, ranged between 58 and 67 degrees, depending on the color and age of the surface and the degree of direct sun exposure. A person who collapses on 65-degree asphalt does not simply overheat from the air. They overheat from both directions simultaneously, from the air above and from the surface below. Contact burns develop within minutes on exposed skin. The heat radiating upward from the surface creates a microclimate at ground level that is several degrees hotter than the measured air temperature. A person lying unconscious on this surface, in direct sun, in 47-degree air, is in an environment that is physiologically closer to 55 degrees than to 47. Emergency responders in Vijayawada during the crisis described arriving at patients who had been on the asphalt for between 20 and 40 minutes before someone had called for help or before help had arrived. In several cases, the patients had contact burns on their arms, legs, and faces from the road surface that were severe enough to require separate treatment. The NIDAM researcher documented 31 cases of road collapse in Vijayawada alone between May 20th and May 28th. These were the cases that had been reported to emergency services. The cases handled informally, carried to a shaded spot, given water, recovering on their own, were not captured. The researcher estimated the actual number of road collapse incidents in the city during that period was between 3 and 5 times the reported figure. Most of the people who collapsed on the roads were men. Specifically, they were men between the ages of 30 and 60 who worked outdoors. Construction laborers, rickshaw drivers, street vendors, agricultural workers who had come to the city and were walking between sites or back to their camps. The profile was not random. It was a profile of people whose work put them in direct sun during the hottest hours of the day with limited access to water and no ability to stop. 300 kilometers to the north, in the city of Hyderabad, a different version of the same crisis was playing out in a different institutional context. Hyderabad is a wealthier city than Vijayawada. It has a larger middle class, more air-conditioned spaces, better hospital infrastructure, and a higher proportion of residents with the resources to manage the heat, to stay indoors, to buy water, to access the private medical system if the government system was overwhelmed. The death toll in Hyderabad was lower per capita than in the smaller cities and rural districts of Andhra Pradesh. But Hyderabad had a population of 8 million people in 2015, and even a lower per capita death rate produces large absolute numbers in a city of 8 million. The city's largest government hospital, Gandhi Hospital, a 1,200-bed facility that serves as a primary referral center for the region, received 1,847 heat stroke patients between May 18th and May 30th. It admitted 892 of them. It discharged most of them within 2 to 4 days. It recorded 74 deaths. 74 deaths in one hospital in 12 days. The medical superintendent of Gandhi Hospital, a man named Dr. Kudandaram, who had been running the facility for 6 years, gave an interview to a Telugu television channel on May 27th that was widely watched. He was asked what the main challenge was. He said the main challenge was not medical. He said the medical team knew how to treat heat stroke. It is not a complicated condition to treat when you have the resources. He said the challenge was that the patients were arriving too late and in conditions that were too advanced for the treatment to be fully effective. He said the gap between when people collapsed and when they reached the hospital was killing them. Not the heat alone. The gap. He said if every person who was going to die of heat stroke in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana that may had arrived at a hospital within 30 minutes of collapsing, the death toll would have been a fraction of what it was. He said this not as an accusation, but as a medical observation. The interviewer asked what would have to change for that to happen. Dr. Kudandaram looked at the camera for a moment before answering. He said, everything. The rural death toll was a part of the crisis that the official numbers captured least accurately and that the researchers who came afterward found most disturbing. In the villages of Guntur, Krishna, Prakasam, and Kurnool districts, the agricultural heartland of Andhra Pradesh, people were dying in conditions where the infrastructure to record their deaths barely existed. A village farmer who died of heat stroke in a field might be found by family members and buried according to local custom within hours, with no doctor present and no death certificate issued. A death certificate requires a doctor. Doctors in rural Andhra Pradesh in 2015 were not present in every village. The primary health centers that served clusters of villages were staffed by 1 or 2 medical officers, covering populations of 30 to 50,000 people across geographic areas that took hours to cross on unpaved roads in May heat. The system was not designed to count these deaths. It was designed imperfectly to treat the living who could reach it. Lakshmi's death was counted. She made it to a clinic. A doctor saw her. A record existed. The district health authority was informed. Her death is in the official 2,500. The man who died in his field in Kurnool district on May 23rd and was found by his son 3 hours later and buried the same evening is probably not in the 2,500. He is in the gap between the official number and the estimated number. He is in the 2,000 to 3,500 additional deaths that the excess mortality analysis suggests existed. He had a name. His family knew it. The record does not. The monsoon arrived on June 8th. It arrived over Kerala, as it normally does, and moved northeast across the subcontinent in the pattern that has defined the Indian agricultural calendar for millennia. When it reached Andhra Pradesh on June 10th, the temperature dropped from 44 degrees to 29 degrees in 6 hours. The rain fell on the cracked earth and the dry fields and the asphalt roads that had been 65 degrees in direct sun and were now cool enough to touch. People stood in the rain. In cities and villages across the 2 states, people had spent 3 weeks managing a heat that had been beyond what they had known stood in the monsoon rain, and let it fall on them. The hospitals continued treating patients for several days after the monsoon arrived. Heat stroke has a delayed presentation in some cases, and patients who had been deteriorating in rural areas continued arriving after the heat had broken. The last heat-related death recorded in the official count occurred on June 12th, 2 days after the monsoon reached the region. Then it was over. The fields began to recover. The construction sites resumed normal hours. The laborers who had survived went back to the same sites in the same heat, wearing the same inadequate protection, drinking the same insufficient water, because the monsoon had come and the emergency was over, and the structural conditions that had produced the emergency were exactly as they had been before it began. After May 2015, India built a plan. The same sentence that began the chapter on Europe after 2003. The same sentence that could begin the chapter after every catastrophe in this series. After people die in numbers large enough to require explanation, institutions build plans. This is not cynicism. Plans save lives, as the European data clearly shows. It is simply an observation about the sequencing. The plan comes after. The dying comes first. India's National Disaster Management Authority had published heat wave guidelines before 2015. They existed on paper. They described early warning systems, public awareness campaigns, water distribution protocols, restrictions on outdoor work. The guidelines were real. Their implementation across 29 states and 640 districts and 640,000 villages was inconsistent in a way that implementation of anything across a country of 1.3 billion people is inconsistent, meaning it worked in some places and did not exist in others, and the places where it did not exist were reliably the places where the people with the least resources lived. After 2015, the implementation became more serious. Ahmedabad, the largest city in Gujarat state, had already developed what became known as the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan in 2013. One of the first such plans in South Asia, developed with support from international public health researchers. The plan created an early warning system tied to meteorological data, mandatory cooling centers in public buildings, prepositioned water distribution points, and a community outreach program targeting the specific populations most at risk. Studies published after the 2015 event showed that Ahmedabad, despite experiencing similar temperatures to Andhra Pradesh, had significantly lower excess mortality, attributable in large part to the plan. The Ahmedabad model became the template. Other Indian cities began adopting versions of it. By 2019, over 100 Indian cities had some form of heat action plan. By 2023, the number had grown further and the plans had become more sophisticated, incorporating real-time temperature monitoring, SMS alert systems reaching mobile phones in rural areas, coordination between health authorities, and the agricultural extension services that had contact with farmers. The death tolls in subsequent Indian heat events declined relative to 2015. Not to zero, not close to zero, but the trajectory moved in the right direction. In May 2022, India experienced another severe heat wave. Temperatures above 45 degrees across Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, and parts of the south. The official death toll was 90. 90, not 2,500. The excess mortality analysis has not been fully published as of this recording, but preliminary estimates suggest the actual toll was higher, several hundred, perhaps more. Still dramatically lower than 2015 in a country whose population had grown by 150 million people in the intervening years. The difference between 2,590 or between 2,500 and several hundred is what a plan looks like when it is built seriously and implemented consistently. It is also worth saying clearly, several hundred people still died. The plan worked and was not enough. Both statements are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. Now the rules. And these rules are different from the rules in every previous episode because the context is different. The rules for surviving a heat wave in Death Valley assume you have a car, a phone, a ranger service within range, and a hospital within 40 minutes. The rules for surviving a European heat wave assume you have an apartment, a neighbor, a phone line, access to a cooling center, and a health system that will eventually reach you. The rules for surviving extreme heat in rural Andhra Pradesh, or in the Sahel, or in any of the places where the infrastructure assumptions of the previous episodes do not apply, are different. They are harder. They require more from the individual because the systems around the individual provide less. Rule 1. Water is not a comfort in extreme heat. It is a mechanical requirement. This sounds simple. in the conditions that killed most of the people in May 2015. It was not simple because the nearest water was unreliable and the nearest shade was often not there. But in every environment, urban construction site, agricultural field, rural road, there are fixed points. The tap that runs in the morning, the tree at the edge of the field, the shop and awning, the government building with a fan. Knowing where these points are before the hottest hours of the day means that when the heat becomes dangerous, a decision about where to go has already been made and does not require cognitive resources that the heat has already begun to take from you. The men who survived the Vijayawada construction sites in May 2015 were, in many cases, the men who had identified the water point, the shaded rest area, the site van with the open door, before the day began. The survival advantage was not physical fitness, or youth, or luck alone. It was the prior knowledge of where the resources were. Map your environment before you need the map. There is something that needs to be said directly at the end of this episode that has been present in the previous episodes, but not stated as plainly. The people who died in May 2015 in Andhra Pradesh were not people who made bad decisions. Raju went back to work the day after his hospital discharge because 3 days without wages was not survivable for his family. Lakshmi went to her field because the field was her livelihood, and the work did not stop because the temperature was dangerous. The construction workers who worked through the midday heat did so because the alternative to working was not eating. The heat killed them. The poverty that removed their options made them killable by the heat. This is not a point about politics. It is a point about survival that is specific and practical. The strategies available to you in a heat emergency scale directly with your resources. More money means more options. Air conditioning, bottled water, the ability to stop working, access to private medical care, a vehicle to reach a hospital. Less money means fewer options and higher risk from the same temperature. The rules in this episode: drink at every opportunity. Get off the road early. Map your resources in advance. Are the rules available to people with limited options? They are not sufficient to close the gap between those with resources and those without. They are what can be done within the constraints that exist. Understanding the constraints is the first step toward changing them. Whether they change depends on decisions made by people and institutions with the power to make them, decisions about labor protections, water infrastructure, heat action plan funding. The gap between guidelines that exist on paper and implementation that reaches a village where the farmer is walking to her field on a 46-degree morning. Those decisions are not in this video. The farmer's name was Lakshmi. She had been working that land for 50 years. The neem tree she was walking toward when she sat down was a tree she had known her whole life. She almost made it to the shade. This is heat limit. In May 2015, between 2,500 and 6,000 people died in 10 days in southern India. Most of them were poor. Most of them were working. Most of them had no option but to be outside in 48-degree heat because the option of not being outside did not exist for them. The plans built after 2015 saved lives in subsequent events. The structural conditions that made those people killable by the heat have not changed in ways that would make them unkillable. Next episode, Karachi, June 2015. A city of 15 million people. 45 degrees Celsius. The power grid fails. And the question of what happens to 15 million people when the electricity that keeps them alive stops. Subscribe. This information is free. The heat is not going anywhere.